So, so obviously this is going to be quite the task, and I do hope you're going to bear with me. We've already had some technical issues, but hopefully we're going to be able to get through them. So over the next hour or so, I'm going to present a glimpse into the richness of Europe's 14 centuries of Islamic heritage, and this will be based on work I have done across the continent through travel, literature, history, and heritage. You know, for those of you that know nothing about me, as Geordie's already said, I'm a travel writer, I work in heritage, I'm an author, and I'm also a fellow at the Centre for Religion and Heritage at the University of Groningen. And in all of these roles, I specialize in Muslim heritage. Um, and much of what I'm about to discuss is either in my most recent book, which Geordie has very kindly plugged for me as well, um, and will also be featuring in my forthcoming book, exploring how where Islam first came to Europe and how it has shaped the continent ever since. So in order to tell the story of Islam in Europe today, I will use those areas that I personally have researched and traveled through to try and succinctly map the continent's 14 centuries of Islamic heritage in less than an hour. With that in mind, please appreciate that some narratives and histories will be skipped or neglected because of the obvious restrictions. And my aim here is to try and present a coherent and connected overview of the Muslim story and its heritage in a bite-sized manner that will hopefully show to everybody here who, of course, is passionate about heritage, the potential and diversity of this heritage. So to do this, for each region or place, I will begin with a quick contextual overview of the Muslim history before detailing some of its tangible and intangible heritage. And in each place or region, I will be presenting it in a kind of loose chronological order to try and map the story of Islam in Europe from its beginnings to the present day. And finally, I'm going to conclude by summarizing the key pieces of Muslim heritage from this presentation. Now, I don't know, Geordie, are we planning Q&As or anything like that at the
Yes.
end?
So
Okay,
when
so
you're done, we can have a Q&A. Yeah.
okay, I will try and stick to the time limits and everything else, Geordie, but please do let me know when I've got about 10 minutes left
Hmm.
from that. So if we can move to the first slide, we're going to go to Cyprus, people.
Hmm.
And we begin in Cyprus because according to the Muslim and Byzantine sources, Cyprus is where Muslims first venture into what we might consider to be Europe today, with several sources claiming the first naval expedition ever launched by a Muslim community or a Muslims per se was launched to Cyprus by the then ambitious governor of Syria, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who in 647, approximately 647 AD, under only the third Caliph, Uthman, the previous Caliph, Omar, refused it on various grounds, but frankly, they were terrified of the sea at the time. But Uthman, Muawiyah was very persistent, and as I say, he was very, very ambitious, which we will see soon enough. Eventually wore down Uthman, who gave him permission to launch the campaign and essentially start what was a naval presence within the fledgling Muslim community. And Muawiyah basically made it clear to Uthman that Cyprus was a very important staging ground for excursions by sea. You know, it was going to be a great naval base, and it was where many attacks were at the time being launched by Byzantine onto Shams, as Syria was known to the Muslims. The other important thing to remember here is that Muawiyah is of the first generation of Muslims. This is a very important thing because, of course, it means that the very first generation of Muslims arrived in Europe. And this generation, for those of you that know your Islamic history and heritage, is amongst the most important of groups when it comes to the Muslim community. The first, second, and third generation, the companions and the Tabi'in and those that came after are highly revered and very, very important to the narrative. And many of these died on Cyprus. So the successful campaign leads to Muslim control over approximately 300 years and ends around 969. During this time, Muslim sources tell us that Muawiyah stationed garrisons there and built a community, and built a city and mosques on Cyprus. The success of the campaign was significant for the early Muslim community, who were emboldened by it, and gives them, and in particular Muawiyah, who becomes later the 6th Caliph of Islam and the first of the dynasty of Umayyads, the confidence to later launch further campaigns overseas, including an attack to the heart of Byzantium in Constantinople. 7 centuries later, when the Ottomans come to conquer Cyprus in the 16th century, they frame this as a reconquest because of this early Muslim presence. And they really embrace this presence and engage with it in quite a fascinating way. As well as the narrative, they also rediscover, you'll notice my hands going up, quotation marks, rediscover many ancient tombs and mosques, creating a kind of retrospective series of heritage sites that link back to the earliest and most revered generation of Muslims, and thus the only such sites in Europe, minus possibly Turkey. So what are the intangible and tangible heritage there today? Well, there is a wealth of Muslim heritage on the island dating from the Ottoman period, but we're going to focus on the earliest. And there are 3 sites where it is claimed that the actual companions of the Prophet are buried, creating truly, genuinely sacred sites for what we call ziyarah, pilgrimage. One of them is in Gerne, right in front of you there, where it is believed that 7, sorry, Geordie, can you click 7? Hopefully the image will come up. 7 tombs of companions are there. Can you see that in the top left corner, Geordie? Just a nod. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then another one, again, Geordie, in the east of Nicosia, where it is believed there are 40 companions of the Prophet buried there. So already we're at what are like 47 alleged companions of the Prophet in Cyprus. But the most important, next slide, the most important is the Hala Sultan Teki Mosque, which is in the south in Larnaca. And this was such a significant site that it was actually saluted by the Ottoman Navy with a gun salute every time their ships would pass in the Mediterranean. And this particular site here, it is alleged to be the final resting place of an actual maternal aunt of the Prophet Muhammad, known as Haram. And in this particular narrative, the story goes that she is part of the first campaign, along with the that Muawiyah brings over to Cyprus, and she. Sorry, is that feedback on my side?
So if all participants could please mute yourselves until the Q&A, that would be great.
And she is part of the campaign. She arrives with the campaign. All right, I'll unmute myself, Geordie, don't worry. She is part of a campaign. She falls off the horse and she dies. And this is actually her whole kind of venture to go across the seas with the Muslim community is actually mentioned in hadith, so in sacred scripture. So this is a narrative that is so powerful that there are some sources claiming that this particular site, the Hala Sultan Teki, Hala comes from the word Hala in Arabic, which means aunt, was considered by many to be the 4th, and in some cases even the 3rd holiest site in Islam, which of course is for some quite a stretch. But the fact that, you know, this narrative went back to a direct descendant, someone who is a relative of the Prophet, made it so significant. Also, there are at least 2 mosques said to sit on the foundations of the earliest ones built in Cyprus. One of them you're looking at in the Hala Sultan, and the other one, Geordie, is the Pir Pasha Lefke, which is on your screens now. In terms of intangible heritage here, of course, we have a narrative of Muslim arrival in Europe, which says that the very first generation of Muslims came to Europe. So Islam was in Europe as soon as Islam arrived, so to speak. And because they also died here, the island remains a deeply sacred space. Cyprus was, of course, key to the start of a Muslim navy as well, another piece of intangible heritage, and taking control of such a pivotal base in the Mediterranean gives them the confidence to launch further campaigns. There is also, of course, as I said earlier, a wealth of Muslim heritage on the island dating from the Ottoman period, including the spectacular mosque in Famagusta that has just come up on your screens, tombs and Sufi lodges, right down to the fact that, of course, the Ottoman presence led to one of Europe's indigenous Muslim communities in the Cypriot Muslims there as well. So from Cyprus, Geordie, we're going to go to Sicily with the next slide. And we are here talking about the Emirate of Sicily. And just to give you an overview, first of all, it was amongst the Byzantine spaces that Muawiyah goes on to attack with his newfound naval prowess and confidence, just 5 years after his success in Cyprus. And this begins a series of attacks or raids over the next century and a half, many led by first generation of Muslims again, some of whom, according to some reports, are also said to be buried on the island, including apparently a niece of the Prophet in Trapani. This eventually leads to the conquest of the island and nearby Malta around 827 AD, led by the North African Aghlabid dynasty, but supported by Muawiyah's European descendants, the Umayyads of Iberia, or Al-Andalus, as it was known by then. The conquest leads to the founding of the Emirate of Sicily, as it was known, which at times also includes parts of the southern mainland of Italy, and at other times, those parts also have their own mini-independent emirates. But the Muslim presence in Sicily, which lasts around 400 years, during which time Muslims rule for about 200, is a pivotal moment in the story of modern Europe. The Emirate of Sicily reaches its zenith under the island's Kalbid dynasty during the 10th and early 11th centuries and becomes a illuminating intellectual and cultural presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, home to a highly educated society where almost everyone can read and write, and even the smallest villages had schools. Somewhere, scholars and poets produced notable works of Islamic jurisprudence, and a fascinating mystical tradition also emerges. The island's population doubles under the Muslim rule, new agricultural techniques developed to support them, and new foods like rice, sugarcane, cotton, lemons, and oranges are introduced to the island, and inventions like paper revolutionize local scholarship and its distribution. Muslim Balham, as Palermo was known, becomes one of the largest cities in the world after Baghdad and Cordoba in Spain, and was so highly regarded, it came to be known simply as Al-Madina Al-Kabira, the great city, a name it rightly retained even under the Normans when they arrived and conquered the island in the middle of the 11th century, as we learn from the Iberian traveller Ibn Jubair, who is still calling Palermo this name when he visits. The Sicilian poet Ibn Hamdis remembers it with the following verse: I think of Sicily, and the memory brings pain to my heart, a place of youthful folly, now desolate, enlivened once by the flowers of noble minds. If I am expelled from paradise, how do I tell of it? If my tears were not bitter, I would believe them to be rivers of that paradise. And this paradise continues under the Normans, when something phenomenal happens, as rulers like Roger II, who's on the screen, and William II, who Ibn Jubair encounters, take on the look and behavior of Muslim rulers, something many Muslim travelers comment on. And they regard themselves as sultans with Arabic pseudonyms, and they speak fluent secular Arabic and give rise to a unique Arab, Norman, Christian culture, art, and architecture. They continue to patronize the arts and commission Muslims like the geographer Al-Idrisi. In time, and particularly under rulers like Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, Sicily becomes a major channel via which the knowledge of the then scientifically and intellectually advanced Muslim world begins to transmit north to the Latin Christian world. For example, works on logic and physics translated from Arabic under Frederick II were sent as presents to the University of Bologna, Italy's oldest university. And nor is this happening in isolation. One of his most prolific translators, Michael Scott, came from working in Toledo, the other great Christian translation and transmission center to the west, in that gradually which gradually made the contents of the great libraries of places like Baghdad, Cairo, Palermo, and Cordoba accessible to Western Europe, which at this time, of course, is reportedly enduring a dark age. So in terms of tangible and intangible heritage, there is a stunning Arabized Christian architectural legacy in the churches, Geordie, and pleasure palaces still standing. So here we have one of the churches, which you can see with its iconic red dome in Palermo. And to the right, we have a fascinating pleasure palace built by William II, known as Lazisa, from the Arabic Al-Aziz, a name normally reserved for God. And we also see the seeds of the Renaissance being planted through the transmission centers in Sicily and up to Italy. In Malta, Geordie, where the tangible evidence is scarce. Oh, back one, please. Where the tangible evidence is scarce, we now have the intangible in Europe's only recognized Semitic language, in the language of the Maltese, which has been largely informed by the ancient Sicilian Arabic that was once the lingua franca of the Emirate of Sicily. One other intriguing intangible piece of heritage is that this luminous culture that sort of develops and becomes apparent under the Cowbids is also probably the only time a proxy of a Shia Caliphate was established in Europe, as the Emirate under the Cowbids answered to the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt. But the other thing I wanted to also say is places like Lazisa also inspired many artists and architects across Europe. And one such example is the Victorian artist Frederick Leighton, who many of you will know, of course, has the famous house in central London, which was inspired by William II's Lazisa. And from Sicily, we head to Al-Andalus, Iberia. Now, to what is still the longest, the place where we witnessed the longest Islamic presence Europe has ever known, where Muslims take control following a campaign by the North African commander Tharik ibn Ziyad around 711, signaling the end of Christian Visigothic Spain. Just hold on, Geordie. A huge relief for the local Jews, and marks the beginning of 9 centuries of Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula and the beginning of Europe's Muslim Golden Age, something that permeates across the Muslim Mediterranean, including, of course, Sicily, Malta, and North Africa, but is very much centered around the Caliphate of Cordoba, which is declared a caliphate by a descendant of Muawiyah in the 10th century. This sees an intellectual and cultural revolution throughout Muslim Portugal and Spain and the aforementioned Mediterranean area that completely alters Europe's future. On the one hand, it's seen as a threat and leads to a response by the Christian kingdoms, and on the other hand, it becomes an intellectual and cultural beacon which helps to revive and reboot Western Europe and brings it out of the post-classical aforementioned dark ages, a feat best summed up by these words of my very own King Charles II of England. The surprise, ladies and gentlemen, is the extent to which Islam has been a part of Europe for so long, first in Spain, then in the Balkans, and the extent to which it has contributed so much towards the civilization, which we all too often think of wrongly as entirely Western. Islam is part of our past and our present in all fields of human endeavor. It has helped to create modern Europe. It is part of our own inheritance, not a thing apart. But Al-Andalus is not just a savior of Western Europe. It is also very much a savior, arguably, for European Jewry, with the Sephardic also experiencing the golden age during this period. And one of the most poetic reflections of just how beautiful this was for the community comes from the lips of the great 12th century Cordoban philosopher and historian Abraham ibn Dawood, who says, "In the days of Hasdai the Nasi, they began to chirp. and in the days of Samuel the Nagid, they sang out loud, reflecting a community not only feeling safe, but secure enough to flourish. The eventual pushback that leads to the Jewish and the Muslims' violent expulsion, called the Reconquest, and culminates in the horrors of the Inquisition, also shapes Iberian modern culture. Now, in terms of tangible and intangible heritage, I'm just going to pick out a few things. So, of course, the golden ages for both the Muslim and the Jewish communities, and the transmission of that light, which are the foundations of Europe's Renaissance, is easily the biggest intangible heritage here, and might well be exemplified by someone such as the Cordoban Ibn Rushd, whose statue in Cordoba is on your screens, whose name was Latinized, of course, to Averroes, and whose translations and interpretation of Aristotle allowed the West to rediscover the great Hellenic sage. And Raphael, go on, Jordi, even paints him into his school of Athens, which is coming up on your screens. And those of you that have ever paid much attention to it need only look in the bottom left corner to see the turbaned interpretation of Ibn Rushd. The pushback narrative offers an intangible heritage that might well be transferred across Western Europe's foundational mythology. For central to this reconquest, Jordi, is the patron saint of the country, St. James, or as he was popularly known, Matamoros, which of course translates to Muslim killer or Moor slayer. The cult of Matamoros, as one Spanish historian recently explained to me, is at the heart of the identity that was constructed for what later becomes modern Spanish identity, and to some extent, arguably, influences Portuguese identity as well. And sadly, one that is based on a hatred and dislike of both Muslims and Jews. In terms of intangible, and I didn't mention this in Sicily as well, of course, one of the major intangible pieces of heritage across this region is the way in which names have been influenced, the toponymy that we see across the entire Mediterranean region where Muslims once lived. And I guess one of the major examples of that would be Gibraltar, which of course is named after Tariq ibn Ziyad, who declared it Jabal al-Tariq, and from that we have the modern name Gibraltar. For Muslims, this is a very, very significant space, and the heritage here is immensely important because, of course, this was a European caliphate. Now, in terms of tangible heritage, I'm sure most of you are well aware of monuments like, Jordi, the Mezquita, and there we have the Mihrab of the Mezquita, which is quite possibly one of the greatest examples of European Islamic art ever constructed anywhere in the continent, and it is still there inside the Mezquita Cathedral in Cordoba. And of course, there's also the Alhambra between them, giving us a unique European Islamic art style, one that influenced directly and indirectly architecture across Europe, something authors like Diana Dark allude to in their books, such as Stealing from the Saracens. So from the Mediterranean region, we head to the Balkans, Jordi, where just as Europe's Mediterranean Muslim presence is beginning to unravel, another Muslim presence is starting up in the east and northeast. Firstly, that through the Islamization of the Tatar Khanates in places like Russia and the Crimean region. And secondly, which is the example that we will discuss here because it's the one I'm most familiar with, and it's the one that affects what we might call Europe proper, is the arrival of the Ottomans. The Ottomans get a foothold in the Balkans at the end of the 13th century, following victory in the Battle of Kosovo, and begin a rapid advance west into Europe that is only halted in Vienna much later. This sees a gradual Islamization of the region that has never really been reversed. It also means by the time Spain's Catholic monarchs are kicking out the Sephardic Jews, the Ottomans are in a position to give them refuge. In fact, Sephardic Jewish historian Jane S. Yerba points out that this was only the last in a long line of expulsions that removed all Jews from Western Europe by 1500, with a few exceptions in Italy and Germany. She also pointed out that as soon as they find themselves in the Ottoman Empire, they begin to again flourish with the emergence of outstanding rabbis, creative mystics, and towering legal figures like Samuel de Medina, Joseph Caro, and she names several others, as Sephardic craftsmen and skilled artisans enlivened the markets of the Near East, while diplomats and courtiers like Don Joseph Nasi and Dona Gracia Mendez, Moses Harmon, and Pikiotos influenced the course of Ottoman diplomacy. Sadly, like most popular historians, she fails to acknowledge that the reason Europe's Jews were for so long safely flourishing in Southern Europe and after 1500 doing the same in Eastern Europe is because both of those regions, during both of those periods, were under Muslim control. Now, in terms of tangible and intangible heritage in this Balkan region, I'm again just going to pick out a few things. There's a wealth of magnificent art and architecture, from the Mostar Bridge on the screen there to a unique Euro-Islamic art style, which is coming up on the screen, known as the tulip style, which merged Baroque Rococo with classical Islamic motifs and can be found in various forms across this region. There was also a wealth of European Islamic mystical traditions, like the Bektashi, whose headquarters are now in the Balkans, and there is an example of one of the Sufi lodges that they founded. We also have in this region what might be considered three of Europe's Muslim countries when we consider the demographic makeup of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, and Kosovo, all of whom are Muslim majority. There's also, of course, in Sarajevo, an actual Muslim European capital city, and another, according to some, in Madrid in Spain. And the preservation of intangible heritage, like the tradition of the Musafir, which, if you bring up the next slide, sorry, not that one, in communities like the Muslim Serbs of Novi Pazar, where I encountered a wonderful series of, well, I had a wonderful series of encounters where the Muslims there really wanted to, really did embrace this culture and tradition within Islamic and pre-Islamic heritage of looking after the traveler. And of course, finally, you can see there's a slide come up which shows a Sephardic synagogue in the Balkans, because of course, as I mentioned earlier, one of the intangible heritage, or you could argue tangible, is the continuation of a Muslim Europe that protected and allowed Europe's Jews to flourish under its rulership for, in total, 12 centuries. And now we go to the Baltic. And so here is a story of one of Europe's oldest Muslim communities, the Baltic Tatars, who do link back to the Khanates that I mentioned earlier. But I'm telling this particular story to illustrate how Europe's Muslim heritage can also be linked to non-imperial narratives like the Ottomans and the Umayyads that we have spoken about already. And also that sometimes these smaller marginalized narratives can be lying in plain sight. The story of the Baltic Tatars goes back to the medieval Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which back then included parts of Poland and Belarus, and was arguably one of Europe's most tolerant pagan empires. At the time, it was being threatened by intolerant Christians and the known as the Teutonic Knights, and the Grand Duke Vytautas turns to his Muslim counterparts in the east for help, who send over a group of Muslims, and I understand possibly some Jewish Tatars as well, from the Crimea to help in their battle against the Teutonic Knights. They win, and as a result, the Duke tells these Muslims and Jews that they are welcome to stay in his kingdom under his protection, and gives them land across his kingdom that now fall into parts of northeast Poland, Belarus, and Lithuania. Over the next 6 centuries or so, they become detached largely from the Crimean culture, especially losing their language, and assimilate with local culture, but do retain their faith and many of their Tatar traditions. They integrate into Lithuanian, Polish, and Belarusian society, take up prominent roles, fight in the armies. Some also help to protect the Jews during the Holocaust. And their culture, sadly, is also almost decimated with the arrival of communism, when hundreds of their unique wooden mosques, like the ones on the screen, are destroyed. One of the other interesting aspects is that many leave for the US as part of the huge European migration in the early 20th century, and found mosques and communities there. So in terms of tangible and intangible heritage here, you've got these wonderful Baltic Muslim villages, and they are amongst the oldest Muslim-founded villages in Europe. Their mosques, like the one here in the village of Nemesis, just outside the capital, are amongst the most unique and localized designs of any European mosques. I'm sure you'll agree. There are Baltic Muslims still alive, like this imam here, many claiming direct descent to that very first community that came and fought alongside the Duke. And, Geordie, they can also lay claim to being founders of what is essentially the oldest surviving mosque in the USA, which you are looking at on that screen in Brooklyn. And I've deliberately put them side by side so you can see the obvious influence architecturally, where the Brooklyn, at the time, Polish and Lithuanian Muslims bought a church building and covered it internally and externally with wooden slats so that it would reflect the mosques that they had left behind in the old country, before adding a beautiful little wooden turret at the top that resembled those on the mosques of their home countries. And now we're nearly there. We are going to head to Britain, Geordie. Now, the Muslim community of Britain, if we can just go back a couple of slides, just one slide, one flip. Oh, well, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. The Muslim community of Britain is largely the result of post-colonial and post-industrial migration, and their story. The reason I'm using Britain, it's the one that I've done the most work on, but it's essentially a microcosm of the story of what you might call Europe's new Muslim communities, largely found across Western Europe. Now, the migration that has led to these large-scale Muslim communities establishing themselves across Western Europe is, of course, heavily linked to colonialism, as many arrived from countries that were directly ruled by the Western nations they now reside in. And this phenomenon is probably best summed up by the words of Sri Lankan thinker A. Sivanandan, who famously said about those migrants, "We are here because you were there." Others arrived because their home nations became destabilized in the post-colonial period, and of course, various other scenarios led to vast amounts of refugees arriving. In the case of Britain, although the majority of British Muslims are the second and third generation offspring of Muslims from countries like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh that were once ruled by the British, the earliest community of Muslim Brits were actually converts, and the result of members of the ruling and wealthier sections of society encountering Islam through their travels and the colonial experience. In terms of tangible and intangible heritage, Islam actually has a lengthy and poorly understood relationship with Britain, as this gold coin minted by Anglo-Saxon King Offa on the screen shows, which includes an actual declaration of faith, and it pays homage to the Caliph in Baghdad. And it was actually minted by King Offa himself, not one of those coins that arrived through trade and that, which of course we have found across the continent. early Islamic coins. Many early Muslim converts, Geordie, include the likes of Marmaduke Pictou, on your screens here, made invaluable contributions to Islamic scholarship. He was possibly the greatest English translator of the Quran in history, and his translation was the very first in English done by a Muslim whose own native tongue was English, and it's been considered as one of the most accessible ever published. Of course, the architectural influence, Geordie, of the modern Muslim spaces of worship are altering Britain's Europe skylines. Here you have the very influential mosque, my own local mosque in the East End of London. And of course, across Western Europe, we see this. But arguably one of the greatest intangible heritage of this particular region is the one that applies to many of the Western European nations, and that is the Muslim contribution to the Great Wars. And it came up early on, but above the coin there is what is now known as the Peace Gardens, but was originally the Woking War Muslim military burial ground, where Muslim soldiers who fought for Britain in the Great Wars, World War I and World War II, were buried. In the case of Britain, it was hundreds of thousands from across the former empire who fought for the freedom of Britain and, of course, much of Europe. And their legacy is only just being acknowledged and their stories only just being told. And of course, if we had the time, we could go on to list many of the contributions that might become tangible and intangible heritage, or already are, by Muslims from both old and new European communities that are happening right now in politics, culture, and the arts. But it's just too many and too little time for that. So I'm going to wrap up, if we go to the next slide, with some conclusions on the 14 centuries of Islam across Europe. So Europe is a sacred place to Muslims, as we've seen. There are reportedly companions of the Prophet, members of the second and the third generation, the most revered generations of Muslims actually buried here in Europe. The next one, Geordie. Europe had enlightened caliphates and emirates that revolutionized the continent. Next one. European Muslim culture arguably instigated the Renaissance. Next one, there's tangible European Muslim heritage, which has shaped the art and architecture and culture of Europe. European Muslims protected European Jews for almost 12 centuries. European Muslim narratives and heritage often remain hidden in plain sight. White European Muslims helped to establish Islam in America. We mentioned, of course, the Baltic Tatars, but this also included Albanian Muslims and Bosnian Muslims who've helped to found some of the earliest mosques in the US. Muslims helped to save what you might call democratic modern Europe through the war effort. New European Muslims, as in those in the Western Hemisphere, are here because Europeans were essentially there. And finally, Europe's amnesia, like its popular history, has been constructed, which, of course, leads me to my final point, which is Europe must try to, is it coming up, Geordie, with the clip? Europe must try to own this amnesia and embrace its Muslim self, because Muslim Europe has been here for 14 centuries. It's still here, and it's going nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. We can now open the floor for any questions, comments. So feel free. So I see in the chat there was a question asking, it was a direct message. If you could tell us the difference between Arabian culture and the heritage of the Ottoman Empire, and the influence on Turkish culture by Byzantine culture as well.
Yeah, I don't think I can sum that up in one in one quick answer. I think it's something, as you've seen, this was quite. As soon as I agreed to do this, I kind of mentally regretted it as well, because I thought, my God, how am I going to be telling this story? 14 centuries of a history and heritage that most people admit that they know very little about, and I'm going to have to try and tell it in 1 hour. So that in itself was terrifying. And I think about 4 times this week, Geordie, I was going to call you up and say, sorry, I'm too sick to do this. I can't even type, and make up all these kind of horrific lies. Now, in terms of the influence on whether we're talking about the Umayyads early on, whether we're talking about any of the Muslim cultures across the Mediterranean basin, and to be honest, in what you might call the Near East, the Levant, it's undeniable the influence of the Byzantines. If you look at that mihrab that I had on the screen, which is in the Mezquita inside Cordoba's Mezquita Cathedral, or Cathedral Mezquita, depending on which side of the argument you're on. That was actually constructed by artisans sent over by the Byzantine emperor at the request of the Umayyad Khalif. So this was not some kind of constant state of war scenario. These two great powers of that time were exchanging culture, they were exchanging artisans, they were exchanging money, they were exchanging prisoners. They were interacting just like modern political entities that actually hate each other pretend to like each other today. So it was happening back then, and so the influence was fluid. And as a result, of course, even right up until the 17th century, when we see the emergence of what I've described as the tulip art style within the Ottoman Empire, we see that influence is still constant, because of course they absorb the Baroque Rococo style, and they integrate it within the classical Islamic. And in fact, the image that I put up looks very Baroque Rococo and looks like it's hardly got any Islamic influence, but because I just wanted to kind of bring that home. But I'm sure many of you have actually visited spaces where you've seen this. But up until now, because of the way in which this history or heritage is discussed or not discussed at all, we don't really appreciate it for what it is. But the influence was immense across all of the Muslim empires, and of course, in reverse, the Muslim culture and heritage influenced the Byzantines and other kind of Christian empires too. I hope that kind of gives you some kind of answer to go on, but yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, I see a hand raise. Karim. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Tharik. Thank you very much for the presentation, which I really enjoyed. I think it was really successful. You were wondering.
Thank you.
And also, from my point of view, what was successful and interesting was the connection and the focus on heritage. So like the connection between tangible and intangible heritage, and the combination of these two. So it made us it made it possible to bring the story and also the complexity of the story, and to bring to focus on various narratives within this story, and to bring also the various perspectives. So I was very happy, and I learned a lot in this half an hour.
Thank you.
I'm not a specialist, but I'm working in on KADOK, Heritage Institute.
Yes.
I'm a historian, so that's maybe this will explain my questions.
Are you working on the current project about 50 years of Flemish Islam?
Of course. So that's so we have an exhibition now in KADOK. So I would like to invite you all for this exhibition. It's on the project, cultural heritage project, on the commemoration of 50 years of recognition of Islam in Belgium. So and that's one point, and then a second point of the KADOK is focusing on history of religion, and of course Islam is part of this. So it's an important focus in the next future. But I have two small questions because it's an interesting topic. So you were talking about Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Mosque,
Yes,
the oldest one, and I was wondering which dates or which period. So I had
so
question.
it's essentially in the early 1900s. I think the society, don't quote me exactly, I can give you exact dates later, but the society is founded around 1907, I want to say. And then they move into the premises shortly after. And what's really beautiful, you must go and visit if you're in New York. The actual custodians right now, it was their grandparents that founded the mosque. And you can walk in, and I remember when I did the radio documentary, they pulled out chalkboards that their grandparents had written Arabic on to teach their parents that was still in the basement. So we're talking about like some amazing heritage there. And America, of course, America's Islamic history, just like Europe's Islamic history, is also so poorly documented and so poorly acknowledged. But theirs isn't necessarily the oldest mosque established in America. There were mosques before that, and arguably many of the Muslim slaves also established small mosque type structures themselves as well, but theirs is the one that has survived and continues to survive. One of the earliest was also founded by Bosnians. There's also early ones founded by Albanian Muslims. But yeah, it's a wonderful space, and if you get a chance, do let me know if you're in Brooklyn. I know the community well. I've done plenty of work with them, and I will be happy to do an introduction.
Thank you for the invitation. So, and then I have a small second question. You were then talking about Britain. You were talking about the earliest mosque came from converts. So that's a fascinating story for me. So I'm, if you could tell a little bit more on that, that would be
so I'll
nice.
try and so Marmaduke Pictou, who I put up on the screen, is representative of that community of converts. He was of a much more kind of privileged class of individuals. And he ends up traveling to Middle Eastern and Muslim countries, and this is obviously where he has this interaction. But the great figure who helps to found what is considered to be Britain's first Muslim community is a gentleman called William Henry Quilliam, who later becomes known popularly as Abdullah Quilliam. And he converts to Islam. Again, these are Victorian Muslims, by the way. Again, in the early part of the back end of the 19th century. And then he founds a mosque up in Liverpool, a house mosque, as in a mosque that is founded inside a house. And then he begins to preach locally and manages to convince quite a large and considerable number of local Liverpudlians who embrace what is known in the popular press as the Muslim church, because of course, you know, they're using the language that the locals will appreciate. And we have this wonderful establishment of a mosque, a school for Islamic studies, a charitable institute, a library, and all these other wonderful things that generally come about when a mosque is established up in Liverpool. And almost around exactly the same time, in the south, near London, a man of Jewish stock known as William Gottlieb Leitner is setting up his Oriental College. And for very different reasons, he decides to build a mosque there as well, which many consider is probably, initially the intentions behind it are more closer to the kind of follies that you would see in wealthy gardens and whatever. But he built it so that Muslim students that would come to the Oriental College could pray there. And after Leitner dies, an Indian lawyer makes his way to Britain, buys the mosque with the help of, again, local wealthy converts, one in particular, Lord Headley, who embraces Islam. And because Lord Headley is a lord, this makes it really, really easy for the Khwaja Kamaluddin, the Indian lawyer, to establish a community and keep away anybody that isn't happy with this. And as he's setting this community up in the early 1900s, the one in Liverpool is in demise. So it's almost like a handing over of the baton. But between them, Karine, in Liverpool, we have the very first mosque in a house. And what Leitner builds is arguably the very first purpose-built mosque, because it looks beautiful. If you Google Woking Mosque, you'll see it. It looks like a mini Taj Mahal, very much an Orientalist fantasy, if we're blunt. And when he builds this, what we now realize, as far as I'm aware, is he is also building the very first purpose-built mosque in northwestern Europe.
And that's
early. And there is
that's early 19th century also. Yes.
Yeah, 1889.
1889.
So
okay.
1889 is the founding. So 1887, the Liverpool Mosque is founded in a house. 1889, Leitner builds his mosque in Woking, and then if you skip over to Germany, you'll see the twin mosque built by the same community in Berlin as well, in the early 1900s, if I remember correctly. And there is a connection between the two. So these are kind of the earliest purpose-built mosques we are seeing in the Northwestern Hemisphere.
And is there a publication on what you have been telling us today? Which
yeah, it's going to come out in a year's time, so make sure you all pre-order it.
No, yeah, okay.
No. I mean, there are.
Yeah.
As somebody who's been researching this narrative, there is nothing that in the popular domain. I'm not talking about academia here. I'm talking about the popular domain. There's nothing that kind of connects the narrative in this way, because nobody has looked at it in that way. And even my next book isn't going to do that, because I'm covering mostly the Mediterranean early presence in that book, whereas my current book, Minarets in the Mountains, deals with the Ottoman presence in the Balkan region and looks at that particular heritage. So no, the answer is the simple answer. But of course, there are lots of different types of literature on the different communities, but they tend to be very niche and are often not found in popular domain and not as easily accessible. But if you are really interested in either of those communities here in Britain, I know plenty of authors here who have written about them, and I can recommend plenty of literature for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments?
I think I saw some stuff in the chat, Geordie.
Yes. So there was two related questions. So it's if you know any heritage organizations focusing on Muslim heritage in Europe, and linked to that, if local communities are involved in the research or access to this knowledge, and if they have any mechanisms to protect their heritage inside the Western world, let's say it says.
Yeah, and also Joseph at the end has pointed out, Thorsten, our colleague, of course, has mapped the Muslim presence in the Larnaca district. Thank you for that, Joseph. I'm also going to just go back and read the one where it says, I missed the name of the first Quran translator in English. Can you please share? That was, he's not necessarily the first Quran translator in English. There were Qurans being translated by non-Muslim English speaking people prior to that, going all the way back to the one that George Sale, I think, did, and ended up in the company of a particular American president. So he wasn't the first, but he was the first English native speaker who was Muslim, and his name was Muhammad Marmaduke Pictou. And then we come to this idea of sorry, what's this? Do you know any heritage organizations in Europe? Yes, we know lots. Myself, Geordie, and many of my colleagues that I can see on the screen, we work with lots of different organizations. In terms of those focusing specifically on Muslim heritage, we are on the hunt to find them. I work with some in Britain, the likes of the Everyday Muslim Heritage and Archive initiative over here is a great example of that. Over in the Netherlands, we have just started working with an organization called Muslim Archive. And so I suspect there are many of these in grassroots scenarios out there. And you know, connecting with them, trying to find them, or empowering them is the difficulty, because of course Muslim heritage isn't given the support or the prominence or the recognition it needs or deserves, and this is one of the difficulties. And I know this firsthand from having worked with somebody like the Everyday Muslim Heritage over here in Britain, where every single project we are constantly struggling to find the funds to get it off the ground. But we don't have those huge heritage institutes yet within the Muslim heritage of Europe. And then there was a question about involvement of local communities during the research and the impact it has on them after its implementation. Do they have access to this knowledge? Are there any mechanism for them to utilize it for the protection of their heritage? Well, that's a very big question. I'm not sure how to answer that one. I recently wrote a paper in a heritage manual that we've published through Routledge, where I talk about my experience developing Britain's very first Muslim heritage trails, the self-guided trails, and how that was done with a grassroots organization called Everyday Muslim, and how we engaged and empowered the local community to not only take part, but to inherit it upon our exit from the project as the people putting it together. So that's a great example of this. And a lot of the work that myself, FRH, the University of Groningen and others are doing on our latest Erasmus project is to explore this particular this exact thing as well. So maybe we should just say watch this space for that one. And I think that's all the questions in the chat, Geordie.
Yeah, I see
Someone's
a hand
got their
raised.
hand up.
Shangyun Chen.
Oh, hey, Jordi and Tariq, good to see you again. My question actually concerns about organizing this talk because we had 40 people, I think, coming to this talk today. And also you mentioned that you were hunting for other organizations, initiatives doing the similar thing. So would you consider there's an increased interest of normal Europeans in the Muslim heritage in general? Also, I know you're doing the Muslim Heritage Trail. You didn't manage to squeeze that in your presentation today, but I'm very interested in it and also want to know, like, how is the participation in this trail? Do you see, because also I think in your conclusion, you said Europe should embrace this amnesia of the Muslim past. So I think the first step maybe is also to get people interested, to be more interested in this.
I agree. And to be honest, Shengen, that's one of the reasons I try to work within the grassroots and the popular domains, because I feel like a lot of what I'm saying, it's completely accessible within the academic world. You can go and find lots and lots of books that will tell you this, which is where, of course, I got most of my knowledge. I'm not some kind of miracle worker who's just gone and dug all this up out of nothing, but it's about making it visible, accessible, and allowing people to engage with it. And so the trails are an example. I did put a little bit of that in there, but I didn't explicitly mention. So the peace gardens that I showed you, Marmaduke Pictou, and actually the very first purpose-built mosque are all part of the trails that I developed in Woking. And the trails are self-guided, and they take people to these free, amazing sites, and they tell people about the significance of that history and its heritage within the wider context of both British history and the Muslim world's history, you could argue. And they were very, very successful. We had a wonderful launch, and we had lots and lots of coverage from the local press and media, and we had lots of people coming to do it. And then COVID came along, where for the very first time in humanity, that certainly in our lifetime, you weren't even allowed to go out. So even though our trails were outside, this kind of really killed the buzz, shall we say, to use a very youthful term. But since then, we have seen a huge uptake. And what's really, really wonderful is the local institutes that we worked with and local grassroots organizations like the mosque, which is currently in the custody of the local Pakistani British community there. The mosque and the local history centre and the cemetery have inherited these trails as their own in many ways by printing many of the trails themselves now, by adding to the literature and making it much more visible and effectively becoming the guardians of the trails. So yeah, that's a little bit more about the trails. I forget what the other question was, Shangyun, sorry.
Oh, I think you've answered it. It's just like,
great.
You say that, sir, increased interest in Muslim heritage in general?
Absolutely. I think there's a huge interest, you know, because let's be honest, we are constantly debating these questions of Muslims in the West, and can they live in Europe, and all of these things, and which of course is a hilarious discussion for anybody who is part of the indigenous European Muslim community. I remember Bosnians Bosnian friends saying to me, we don't understand this debate. Why don't you just tell them to come and talk to us? We've been Muslim for 6 centuries and we're European. And, you know, I'm sure they'll get an idea of it. So I think this is constantly at the forefront of people's thoughts. But understanding the heritage and history is difficult. And for me, one of the most difficult and problematic aspects of it is the popular narrative that claims it is not even there. So you only have to go into any bookshop and pick up popular histories on Europe, and you will see how shockingly poor the discussion is on Muslim heritage, Muslim contribution, Muslim presence, the historic one I'm talking about here. It might even be 3 or 4 pages in a book of, you know, I don't know, 300 pages. I do this all the time. I partly for my research, but partly because I want to find literature in the popular domain that I might be able to use myself. And it's just, yeah, it's really bad.
Okay, we might have time for a final question or comment, if anybody would like to. No final questions. Okay. Well, the video will be made available. So for all those who joined late or would like to rewatch it or share, you'll have the chance to do so. And a giant thanks to Tharik for this wonderful presentation. It was extremely enlightening for all the reasons that came up. It's a very overlooked heritage in Europe, and it's very good that we have this opportunity and chance to share this wider. So thank you so
very
much
for giving me the opportunity to present in this way, Geordie. It really has been a wonderful honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all participants.